My name is Karl Thompson, 68 years old and recently retired after 4 decades teaching high school history. When my wife Martha passed away 2 years ago, I never expected my son Brian and his wife Stephanie would suddenly become so attentive. They suggested I sign over my house to them for tax purposes. Seemed reasonable enough, until that day. They drove me to a gas station 80 miles from home, went inside for coffee, and never came back. What they never expected was the fine print that would change everything. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and hit subscribe to find out what happened when I discovered what was in the fine print that would turn everything around. Retirement was supposed to be the golden chapter of my life. After 40 years molding young minds as a history teacher at Lincoln High School, I had earned my rest. I had plans with Martha to travel, to visit the historical sites I had lectured about for decades, but never seen with my own eyes. We were going to explore Civil War battlefields, walk through colonial Williamsburg, and maybe even take one of those river cruises through Europe she always talked about. But life rarely unfolds according to plan. Martha started feeling tired all the time, more than usual for a woman in her 60s. When she developed a persistent cough, I finally convinced her to see Dr. Phillips. The diagnosis came back like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Stage 4 lung cancer. Martha, who had never smoked a day in her life. For 11 months, I watched my vibrant, loving partner of 45 years fade away. The chemo took her beautiful silver hair. The radiation burned her skin. But it was the cancer that stole her laugh. That musical sound that had been the soundtrack to my life for nearly half a century. She fought hard, my Martha, not out of fear of death. She was too practical for that, but because she worried about me being alone. I remember our last coherent conversation, her thin hand clutching mine with surprising strength. Her blue eyes, sunken now but still bright with the intelligence that had first attracted me to her at a college mixer back in 1975, locked onto mine. She said, "Take care of yourself, Karl, and be careful with Brian and that wife of his. Their values are different from ours." I dismissed her concerns then, chalked them up to the morphine or a mother being overprotective of her husband. I should have listened. Martha always saw people more clearly than I did. Our house on Maple Street was nothing fancy by modern standards. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a den I had converted into a home office where I graded papers, and a sunroom Martha had filled with plants that I struggled to keep alive after she was gone. We bought it 30 years ago for $90,000. A stretch on 2 educators' salaries at the time. Martha taught 4th grade at Roosevelt Elementary until she retired 5 years before her diagnosis. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the decades. What was once a quiet, middle-class suburb had become prime real estate as the city expanded. Similar houses on our street were now selling for over $500,000, a fact that had not escaped Brian and Stephanie's notice. Brian was our only child. A happy accident when we had almost given up on having children. I still remember holding him for the first time, this red-faced, squalling bundle that somehow instantly became the center of my universe. I taught him to fish at the lake house my parents left me, helped him with his algebra homework, never missed a single baseball game even when it meant rescheduling parent-teacher conferences. When he was accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, I felt a pride so intense it brought tears to my eyes. First one in the family to go to college. Martha and I scraped together every penny to make sure he graduated debt-free. We wanted him to start his adult life without that burden. He met Stephanie during his junior year. She was studying business administration, while Brian pursued engineering. Smart, ambitious, strikingly beautiful with her long auburn hair and designer clothes that must have cost a fortune. From the beginning, there was something calculated about her politeness toward Martha and me that made me uneasy. But Brian was clearly besotted. After graduation, they had a lavish wedding that Stephanie's parents paid for, making it clear they didn't want our modest contribution. They moved to the city for jobs at prestigious firms, buying a house in an exclusive neighborhood with a mortgage that made my stomach clench when Brian let the amount slip during a phone call. Their visits grew less and less frequent. Birthdays and Christmases sometimes, usually with Stephanie checking her watch and mentioning early meetings the next day. Brian changed too. My son, who once spent hours discussing history and philosophy with me, now only talked about promotions, car upgrades, and the vacations they couldn't really afford but took anyway because, as Stephanie often said, they deserved it. When Martha got sick, they came to the hospital exactly twice. Brian called regularly, to his credit, but Stephanie was always too busy with work commitments to visit her dying mother-in-law. After the funeral, they helped for exactly 3 days before urgent matters at the office called them back to the city. For almost 2 years, I rattled around our family home alone. I kept teaching that first year after Martha died, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The students noticed, the principal noticed, and eventually I admitted to myself that it was time to retire. With my pension, Social Security, and the modest savings we had accumulated, I could live comfortably, if not luxuriously. Then something unexpected happened. Brian and Stephanie began calling more frequently. Their visits increased from twice a year to monthly, then weekly. At first, I was simply grateful for the company. The silence in the house had become oppressive, and I had started talking to Martha's plants just to hear a human voice, even if it was only my own. It was during their 3rd consecutive weekend visit that I noticed the first red flag. I came back from the bathroom to find Stephanie quickly setting down a stack of mail she had been rifling through. Bills and bank statements, mostly. When she saw me, she smiled too brightly and asked if I wanted more coffee. Later that day, I overheard them whispering in the kitchen, catching only fragments. This place must be worth at least. And how much do you think he has in savings? And do you think he has updated his will since your mom? I should have confronted them then and there. But loneliness is a powerful weakness, and I was so desperate for my son's attention that I convinced myself I had misheard or misunderstood. Besides, wasn't it natural for them to be concerned about my finances now that I was a widower living alone? So I ignored the red flags. I ignored Martha's warning, and I welcomed the wolves right through my front door. Their campaign was so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that I hardly noticed it happening. Brian started showing up on Saturday mornings to mow my lawn, something he had never done as a teenager without significant bribery. Stephanie brought groceries, noticing items I was running low on without me having to mention them. They invited me to dinner at their house, a rare occurrence before, and made a show of preparing Martha's famous pot roast recipe. These small kindnesses touched me deeply. After 2 years of crushing loneliness, having family around again felt like coming in from a blizzard to a warm fireplace. My defenses were already low when they began planting their seeds of doubt. It started innocuously enough. Stephanie noticed a water stain on the ceiling near the upstairs bathroom. Just a small discoloration that I hadn't even registered. "That looks like it could be a leaky pipe, Karl," she said, her brow furrowed with what seemed like genuine concern. "These old houses require so much maintenance." My parents spent a fortune on repairs before they finally downsized. Brian chimed in, inspecting the spot with exaggerated care. "We should call a plumber for you, Dad. These things can get expensive fast if you don't address them." Before I could respond that I was perfectly capable of calling my own plumber, Stephanie was scrolling through her phone contacts. My friend Alicia just had her whole bathroom redone. The contractor was reasonable and very trustworthy. "I'll get his number for you." This pattern repeated over the following weeks. They pointed out the settling crack in the foundation that had been there for 20 years without causing problems. They expressed concern about the steep stairs to the 2nd floor. "What if you fell, Dad? Living alone at your age." They mentioned the property taxes that were indeed rising as the neighborhood gentrified, but that I could still comfortably afford. With each visit, they introduced new reasons why my beloved home was becoming a burden I shouldn't have to bear in my golden years. They were so attentive, so seemingly concerned for my welfare, that I couldn't see the strategy behind their observations. Then came the suggestions, subtle at first but increasingly direct. "You know, Dad," Brian said one evening as we finished dinner at their house, their dining room gleaming with wedding china they rarely used. "We have that finished basement that just sits empty except when Stephanie's parents visit twice a year. It has its own bathroom and even a little kitchenette." Stephanie jumped in eagerly. "It's practically an apartment. You would have privacy when you wanted it, but you wouldn't have to worry about home repairs or cooking for one." The thought of moving in with them, becoming dependent on my son and daughter-in-law, made me profoundly uncomfortable. Martha and I had always valued our independence. We had saved and planned, specifically to avoid becoming burdens to Brian. I appreciate the offer, but I like my house. All my memories with your mother are there. I saw a flash of frustration cross Stephanie's face before she composed it into sympathetic understanding. Of course, Karl, we completely understand. But think of the financial advantages. You could sell the house now while the market is strong, invest the money, and have a much more comfortable retirement. The property taxes alone must be eating into your fixed income. I admitted that the taxes had gone up considerably, and they pounced on this concession like lawyers at a deposition. Over the next few visits, they introduced me to their friend Roger, a financial advisor, they said, who had helped Stephanie's parents with their retirement planning. Roger was smooth, articulate, dressed in an expensive suit that made my retired teacher wardrobe look shabby by comparison. He arrived with charts and graphs and a laptop presentation about estate planning and tax advantages. My son asked me to look over some options for managing your assets more efficiently, Roger explained, his tone suggesting he was doing me an enormous favor. Property rich and cash poor is a common situation for retirees, but there are solutions. The solutions all seem to involve transferring my assets in some way. The terminology was confusing, deliberately so I would later realize. They talked about qualified personal residence trusts, life estates, irrevocable transfers with retained interests, using technical jargon that made my head swim. When I asked straightforward questions, their answers were vague but delivered with absolute confidence. When I expressed concerns, they were dismissed with reassurances about standard practice and family protection. The proposal they eventually settled on seemed reasonable on its surface. I would transfer the deed to Brian but retain a life estate, guaranteeing my right to live in the house until my death. This would remove the property from my taxable estate, they explained, and protect it from potential healthcare costs if I ever needed long-term care. What they conveniently failed to explain was that I would lose the right to sell the property myself if I needed the money, or that Brian could potentially take out loans against the equity without my knowledge. Family taking care of family, Roger said warmly, closing his laptop. That's what this is all about. Your son wants to make sure you're protected. Brian placed his hand on my shoulder. Dad, Mom would want us to take care of these things now, before there's a crisis. This is just good planning. The mention of Martha gave me pause. Would she want this? I remembered her warning about Brian and Stephanie, but surely she would approve of sensible financial arrangements. Maybe I was being stubborn and old-fashioned by hesitating. I need some time to think about it, I finally said. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, in the bedroom where Martha and I had slept for 30 years. The house creaked and settled around me, familiar sounds that had become comforting over the decades. Could I really sign it away? Even with the promise I could stay, something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. The next day, I called my old friend Jack for advice. We had taught together at Lincoln High for 30 years, Jack in the math department while I handled history. Since retiring, he had developed an interest in woodworking, building beautiful furniture in his garage workshop. Unlike me, Jack had adjusted well to widowerhood after losing his wife Georgia 5 years earlier. Karl, my friend, he said after I explained the situation. That sounds fishy as hell. Why'd they bring their own financial guy instead of suggesting you talk to someone at your bank? I defended Brian, saying he was just trying to help, that he was concerned about my financial security. Jack wasn't buying it. Remember when your Martha was sick and they couldn't be bothered to visit? Now suddenly they're at your house every weekend talking about your assets. Use that historian's brain of yours, Karl. Connect the dots. But loyalty to my son ran deep, and I dismissed Jack's suspicions as cynicism. After all, people change. Maybe Brian's recent attentiveness was his way of making up for his absence during Martha's illness. Maybe losing his mother had made him realize the importance of family. How wrong I was. How terribly, tragically wrong. The pressure increased exponentially after I told Brian I was still considering the proposal. Suddenly, there was an urgent tax deadline approaching, though they were frustratingly vague about the specifics. Important documents had to be signed right away, to protect my assets from some imminent change in estate tax laws that Roger had supposedly caught wind of through his professional connections. When I suggested consulting another financial advisor or an attorney, Stephanie looked personally offended. "Karl, we went to the trouble of bringing Roger to you because he specializes in situations exactly like yours, is already familiar with our family finances. Starting over with someone new would take weeks, and we don't have that kind of time." Brian was more direct in his manipulation. "Dad, we've been driving out here every weekend for months trying to help you get your affairs in order. We rearranged our entire lives because we're worried about you. After all we've done, you still don't trust us." The guilt was effective. I had raised my son to value family loyalty above all else, and now those lessons were being weaponized against me. When that didn't work quickly enough, they invoked Martha. "Mom would be so upset seeing you struggle alone in this big house," Brian said, his voice catching in what I now realize was manufactured emotion. "She always said she'd want us to take care of each other if anything happened to her." It was a masterful distortion of what Martha had actually said to me on her deathbed, but I was too emotionally manipulated to see it clearly. The notary appointment was arranged with suspicious efficiency. No neutral location like a bank or legal office. Instead, a woman named Diane arrived at my house on a Tuesday morning, her notary stamp and documents in a leather portfolio. Brian and Stephanie were already there when she arrived. Stephanie busy in my kitchen baking what she knew was my favorite apple pie, filling the house with the comforting aroma of cinnamon and pastry. "Look what we're doing for your dad," their actions screamed. "See how much we care." While the pie baked, Brian pulled out his phone to show me photos of their basement guest room. "Look, Dad, we've already started preparing the space for when you visit. We got a new mattress for the bed since the old one was pretty lumpy. And there's plenty of storage for whatever personal items you want to bring." The implication was clear, though unspoken. The transfer was a foregone conclusion, and they expected me to be spending significant time at their home in the near future. Still, the gesture seemed sweet, and the room looked comfortable in the carefully staged photos. When Diane spread the documents across my dining room table, the atmosphere shifted. What had been warm family concern suddenly became brisk efficiency. Brian stood at my elbow, pointing to signature lines with rapid-fire explanations. "This confirms you're of sound mind and signing voluntarily. This establishes the life estate. This is just administrative. This acknowledges receipt of consideration." The documents were dense with legal terminology, the font small and the paragraphs long. When I tried to read one section more carefully, Stephanie interjected. "The pie is almost ready. Karl, we don't want it to burn. Diane has another appointment across town in 45 minutes. The implicit message was clear. Don't be difficult. Don't embarrass us in front of the notary. Don't waste everyone's time with unnecessary reading." I signed. God help me. I signed multiple documents without fully understanding them. Diane witnessed the signatures, applied her notary stamp, and was ushered out by Stephanie within 20 minutes of arriving. The entire transaction that would upend my life took less time than a typical doctor's appointment. As soon as the front door closed behind Diane, the atmosphere in the house transformed again. Brian opened an expensive bottle of champagne he had apparently brought with him in a cooler, already chilled and ready. Stephanie cut generous slices of apple pie. They were jubilant, congratulating me on my wise decision, toasting to family security and peace of mind. I felt uneasy but tried to dismiss it as natural anxiety about any major decision. The champagne helped dull the nagging voice in the back of my mind that sounded suspiciously like Martha telling me I had made a terrible mistake. Later that evening, as I was washing the dessert plates, I overheard Stephanie on her phone in the living room, speaking in a hushed but excited tone. "It's done," she said to someone on the other end. "Everything went exactly as planned. We'll move to phase 2 tomorrow." When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she quickly ended the call and flashed a brilliant smile. "Just updating my boss about taking tomorrow off," she explained smoothly. "We thought we'd take you to lunch to celebrate." I nodded and returned to the dishes, my hands trembling slightly in the soapy water. What exactly had I done? What was phase 2? The champagne buzz had worn off, leaving behind a leaden feeling of dread in my stomach. That night, Alone in my bedroom, I tried to make sense of the documents I had signed. I should have asked for copies, but in the orchestrated rush, the thought hadn't occurred to me. I considered calling Jack, but was too embarrassed to admit I had gone through with the transfer despite his warnings. So I lay awake, listening to the familiar creaks of my house, wondering if I had just signed away the last physical connection to my life with Martha. The doorbell rang at 8:30 the next morning, far earlier than Brian and Stephanie typically arrived for their weekend visits. When I opened the door in my bathrobe, they stood on the porch with coffee and a bag of bagels, both dressed casually in jeans and light jackets. "Rise and shine, Dad," Brian said with a broad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We brought breakfast." I let them in, confused by the early arrival but grateful for the coffee. As I reached for the cup Stephanie offered, she exchanged a quick glance with Brian that sent a chill down my spine. There was something predatory in that look, something calculated that I had never wanted to see directed at me from my own family. "We were thinking," Brian began as I sipped the strong black coffee, "since we're all together and Steph and I both took the day off, why don't we take a drive? There's a really nice retirement community about an hour from here that a colleague of Stephanie's father just moved into. We thought you might want to see it, just to get some ideas for the future." His tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his posture. Stephanie was uncharacteristically quiet, fiddling with her phone and not meeting my eyes. "I don't need a retirement community," I said slowly. "I have my house." Stephanie looked up then. "Of course you do, Karl. This is just exploratory. It's always good to know your options before you need them. It's a beautiful facility with independent living apartments and gorgeous grounds. Just a day trip. We'll have you home by dinner." Something about their insistence made me deeply uncomfortable, but I had already disappointed them by hesitating over the deed transfer. And wasn't this what families did? Look out for each other, plan for the future? Maybe I was being stubborn again, resistant to change in the way elderly people often became. "Let me get dressed," I said finally. 20 minutes later, we were in their luxury SUV heading out of town. Brian drove while Stephanie controlled the music from the passenger seat, playing bland, easy listening that she probably thought appealed to my generation. I sat in the back like a child, watching familiar landmarks slide past the window. The hardware store where I bought supplies for countless home repair projects. The park where Martha and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons. The ice cream shop where we took Brian for special treats when he was small. As we left the city limits and headed onto the highway, a sense of foreboding began to grow in my chest. We passed the exit that would lead to the affluent suburb where several upscale retirement communities were located. When I pointed this out, Stephanie said breezily, "Oh, this place is a bit farther out. Much more scenic setting." The scenery became increasingly rural, small towns giving way to farmland, and then more densely forested areas. After about an hour, we turned off the main highway onto a secondary road. The conversation had dried up, an unusual tension filling the car. "This seems quite remote for a retirement community," I ventured, trying to keep my tone light. "It's very exclusive," Stephanie replied without turning around. "Wonderful privacy." Another 30 minutes of driving brought us to a small town I didn't recognize. The main street featured a few struggling businesses, a diner, and a gas station with a mini-mart attached. Brian pulled into the gas station, the tires crunching on gravel. "Need to fill up," he announced, "and I could use a coffee." "Anyone else?" "I could use the restroom," I admitted. Stephanie unbuckled her seatbelt. "He'll come in too. We'll grab coffees for everyone." I waited in the car, expecting one of them to return quickly so I wouldn't be left alone with their expensive vehicle. 5 minutes passed. 10. I began to wonder if there was a line for the restroom or if the coffee was being brewed fresh. After 15 minutes, I decided to stretch my legs and perhaps check on them. The day was pleasant, warm for early autumn but not uncomfortable. I walked toward the mini-mart, noting absently that the town was quiet for a weekday, almost sleepy. As I reached for the door handle, movement in the periphery of my vision caught my attention. Brian's SUV was pulling out of the parking lot. I stood frozen, my hand still extended toward the door, as I watched my son and his wife drive away. Surely they were just repositioning the car, perhaps moving to the air pump or parking in a proper space rather than in front of the convenience store entrance. But the SUV turned back onto the main road and accelerated, quickly disappearing around a bend. They were gone. The reality of what had just happened didn't immediately register. My mind, unwilling to accept such a betrayal, manufactured reasonable explanations. They were playing a practical joke. They needed to run a quick errand. They'd forgotten something and would be right back. I waited outside the mini-mart for several minutes, expecting the SUV to reappear at any moment. When it didn't, I went inside, thinking perhaps they were still there and I'd somehow missed them. A quick scan of the small store confirmed what I already knew. Brian and Stephanie were gone. A young man behind the counter looked up as I approached, taking in my confused expression with mild interest. "Excuse me," I began, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Did you see a younger couple come in here? A man and woman in their 30s? "Yeah, about 20 minutes ago. Got coffees and used the restroom. The woman bought a pack of gum. Left in a hurry." "Did they say anything?" The clerk, whose name tag read Alan, shook his head. "Not to me. Just paid and left." The clerk hesitated, studying my face more carefully. "You okay, sir? You look kind of pale." The reality was finally beginning to sink in, bringing with it a wave of nausea. They had left me here, in a town I didn't know, at least 80 miles from home, with no transportation, no explanation. My son had abandoned his elderly father at a gas station. I think my ride left without me," I managed to say. Alan's expression shifted from mild interest to concern. "For real? Like they forgot you were with them?" I couldn't bring myself to say the truth, that it hadn't been a mistake, that my own son had deliberately driven me to a remote location and abandoned me like an unwanted pet on a country road. "I need to call them," I said instead. "My phone is in their car." Alan, who couldn't have been more than 25, immediately reached under the counter and produced his own cell phone. "Here, use mine." With shaking fingers, I dialed Brian's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again with the same result. Then I tried Stephanie's number. Also, voicemail. I left messages on both phones, trying to keep my voice calm, explaining that they had left without me and asking them to return. Alan watched with growing alarm as I made the calls. When I handed his phone back, he asked, "No answer?" I shook my head, the enormity of the situation crashing down on me like a physical weight. "Look, there's a bench over there by the window," he offered, gesturing to a small seating area where travelers presumably ate their convenience store purchases. "Why don't you sit down and try again in a few minutes? Maybe they just drove down the road a bit and don't have service." I nodded gratefully and made my way to the bench on unsteady legs. The world had taken on a surreal quality, as if I were moving through a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. I sat by the window, watching the occasional car pass on the main road. None of them the distinctive silver SUV that had brought me here. Every 15 minutes or so, I used Alan's phone to call again. Each call went to voicemail. After an hour, the gravity of my situation became impossible to deny. This hadn't been a mistake. They hadn't forgotten me. They had deliberately abandoned me in a town I didn't know, without transportation, without my phone, without explanation. The calls became more frequent as panic set in. By the 2-hour mark, I had left 25 missed calls on Brian's phone alone, plus messages that evolved from confused to desperate to angry. The entire time, Alan kept checking on me between helping the occasional customer, offering water, suggesting local resources. His simple kindness, in the face of such cruelty from my own flesh and blood, brought tears to my eyes. As afternoon faded toward evening, I finally told Alan the whole truth, about the deed transfer the day before, about the suspicious early morning arrival and suggestion of visiting a retirement community, about my growing suspicion that my son and daughter-in-law had orchestrated this entire scenario to get me out of my house permanently. "That is seriously messed up," Alan said when I finished, his young face a mask of indignation. "That's elder abuse, man. We should call the cops." I was reluctant at first. Calling the police meant admitting publicly that my own son had abandoned me, making real a betrayal I was still struggling to process. But as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, I realized I had no alternative. I was an old man, stranded in an unfamiliar town with night coming on and nowhere to go. With a heavy heart, I nodded my permission, and Alan made the call that would set in motion events that would ultimately save me, though I couldn't have known it then. Officer Rodriguez arrived about 20 minutes after Alan called the police. She was a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that somehow managed to convey compassion without pity. She took my statement methodically, asking clarifying questions that revealed her sharp mind. "Let me make sure I understand correctly, Mr. Thompson," she said, her pen poised over her notepad. "Your son and daughter-in-law drove you 80 miles from your home, stopped at this gas station under the pretense of getting coffee, and then deliberately drove away, leaving you stranded. And this happened the day after they had you sign paperwork transferring your house to them." Hearing it laid out so starkly made me flinch, but I nodded. "And how long has it been since they left?" "About 5 hours now." Officer Rodriguez pursed her lips, her disapproval evident. "And you've made numerous attempts to contact them, all of which have gone unanswered." 25 calls to my son's phone alone," I confirmed. She closed her notebook decisively. "Mr. Thompson, what you're describing is elder abuse and abandonment, which are criminal offenses in this state. I'm going to contact Adult Protective Services right away. In the meantime, let's figure out a safe place for you to stay tonight." I hadn't thought that far ahead, had been operating on the increasingly desperate hope that Brian would return, that this was some horrible misunderstanding. The reality that I would be spending the night in this strange town hit me with fresh force. Alan, who had been listening nearby while pretending to restock a shelf of snack chips, spoke up. "There's a motel about 2 blocks down. Nothing fancy, but it's clean. My aunt works there. I could call her." Officer Rodriguez smiled at him. "That would be helpful, thank you." She turned back to me. "Mr. Thompson, do you have access to funds for a room? If not, there's emergency assistance available." I thought of my wallet, sitting in my bedside drawer at home, because I hadn't expected to need it for what was supposed to be a short day trip with family. I hadn't brought anything with me except the clothes I was wearing. "I don't have my wallet," I admitted. It didn't occur to me to bring it. The compassion in Officer Rodriguez's eyes deepened. She understood the implication. I hadn't brought my wallet because I had trusted my son completely. That trust had been my undoing. "I'll contact Adult Protective Services now," she said, stepping away to make the call. Alan's shift had ended while we were talking to the officer, but he stayed, clearly concerned about my welfare. When Officer Rodriguez returned, she informed me that a social worker named Jessica would be arriving shortly from the county office. Jessica arrived within the hour, a middle-aged woman with a practical haircut and comfortable shoes, who reminded me a little of Martha in her no-nonsense efficiency. She quickly arranged emergency accommodation at a senior living facility with temporary housing options. "We have a studio apartment available in our emergency housing section," she explained. "It's fully furnished and meals are included. You can stay there while we sort this situation out." I felt overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers in contrast to the cruelty of my own family. Alan even offered to drive me to the facility following Jessica's car, refusing my attempts to promise repayment once I had access to my accounts again. "I hate what happened to you, man, but I'm glad you ended up at my gas station and not somewhere else," he said as we drove through the darkened streets. Some people wouldn't have cared. The temporary apartment was small but clean, with a bed, sitting area, kitchenette, and private bathroom. Jessica helped me get settled, providing toiletries and even a change of clothes from the facility's donation closet. Before leaving, she sat down across from me at the small dining table. "Mr. Thompson, tomorrow we'll need to address the legal aspects of your situation. That deed transfer may have been executed under false pretenses, which could make it invalid. But tonight, try to get some rest. You're safe here." "Safe," the word echoed hollowly. How could I feel safe when my own son had betrayed me so completely? The next morning, Jessica returned with Franklin Davis, a legal aid attorney who specialized in elder law. He was younger than I expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. "Mr. Thompson," he began after introductions, Jessica has briefed me on your situation. Am deeply concerned about the circumstances under which you signed over your property. Based on what you've described, we may have grounds for an emergency injunction to halt any attempts to sell or mortgage your home. He asked me to recount exactly what had happened, from the initial suggestions about transferring the deed through the abandonment at the gas station. As I spoke, he took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific statements Brian or Stephanie had made. When I finished, Franklin looked up from his notepad, his expression serious but not without hope. "Harris, something critical," he said. "You mentioned that one of the documents stated you were of sound mind and signing voluntarily, correct?" I nodded, remembering Brian's rapid explanation as he pointed to that signature line. "That clause actually works in our favor now," Franklin explained. "By abandoning you at that gas station, your son and daughter-in-law demonstrated clear bad faith and coercion. Their actions directly contradict the document's assertion that this was a voluntary transaction between caring family members." He leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. "Mr. Thompson, I believe we have grounds to void this transfer. The abandonment creates a clear timeline that shows their intent all along was to remove you from your home under false pretenses. For the first time since watching Brian's SUV disappear around that bend, I felt a flicker of hope. What do we do now?" I asked. "First, Jessica will help you get emergency access to your bank accounts so you can get cash and replacement identification. Then we'll file for an emergency injunction to prevent any sale or alteration of your property while we challenge the deed transfer." Jessica nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, Officer Rodriguez has filed a police report for elder abandonment, and the county is opening an investigation into financial elder abuse. My head was spinning with legal terminology and procedures, but one thing was becoming clear. What had happened to me wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was illegal. And there were systems in place to help people like me, even when their own families had failed them. As promised, Jessica took me to my bank, where the manager, after seeing the police report and hearing a brief explanation of my situation, provided emergency access to my accounts. With funds secured, we purchased basic necessities and returned to the senior housing facility. That evening, as I sat in the small apartment trying to process the whirlwind events of the past few days, I found myself absently searching through my wallet, now restored to me with temporary replacement cards. Behind my driver's license, I discovered a business card I'd forgotten was there. Sandra Williams, Assistant District Attorney, with a handwritten note on the back. "For my favorite teacher, thanks for believing in me, Sandra." Sandra had been one of my students 15 years earlier, a brilliant girl from a disadvantaged background who had overcome tremendous obstacles to attend law school. I'd written her countless recommendation letters and spent hours helping her prepare scholarship applications. Now she worked for the district attorney's office in my home county. With trembling fingers, I dialed her number using the facility's phone. Sandra Williams, a crisp, professional voice answered. "Miss Williams, this is Karl Thompson. I was your history teacher at Lincoln High." There was a momentary pause, then a warm exclamation of recognition. "Mr. Thompson, what a wonderful surprise. How are you?" The simple question broke something inside me, and to my embarrassment, I found myself choking back tears as I answered. "Not well, I'm afraid. I need help, Sandra." Without hesitation, she replied. "Then you'll have it. Tell me everything." Sandra's response was immediate and decisive. After hearing my story, her professional demeanor gave way to genuine outrage. "Mr. Thompson, this is unconscionable. I specialize in prosecuting white-collar crime, but I work closely with our elder abuse unit. Let me connect you with Detective James. He'll want to investigate this right away." Within 24 hours, Detective James had driven to meet me at the senior housing facility. He was a burly man with a methodical approach and a surprising gentleness that put me at ease despite the painful subject matter. "We're going to build this case step by step, Mr. Thompson," he assured me. "Starting with the gas station abandonment, which is the clearest criminal act, and working backwards to the financial manipulation." He took my full statement, recording it officially, and then drove to interview Alan at the gas station. By the end of the day, He had secured the security camera footage, showing Brian and Stephanie entering the mini-mart with me in the car and leaving hurriedly without me. Meanwhile, Franklin Davis was moving with impressive efficiency on the legal front. He filed emergency motions with the court to prevent any sale or alteration of my property and to void the deed transfer based on fraud and coercion. We secured a temporary hearing date for the following week, he informed me. The judge assigned to our case takes elder abuse very seriously. In the meantime, I've placed a formal notice with the county records office flagging your deed as being under legal dispute. Jessica continued to be my lifeline, coordinating between the various agencies now involved in my case and ensuring my immediate needs were met. She helped arrange transportation back to my home county for the court hearing and connected me with a support group for seniors who had experienced family financial abuse. Each night, I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, trying to make sense of how my relationship with my son had deteriorated to this point. Where had I gone wrong as a parent? What had happened to the bright, compassionate boy I'd raised? The questions haunted me, but alongside the pain, a newfound determination was growing. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a nervous energy that reminded me of my first aid teaching decades ago. Franklin met me at the courthouse steps, his briefcase bulging with documents and his expression confident. "We're well prepared, Mr. Thompson. Detective James' investigation has been thorough, and the evidence of bad faith is overwhelming." We entered the imposing building and made our way to the designated courtroom. As we approached the doors, I saw them, Brian and Stephanie, huddled with a sharp-looking attorney in an expensive suit. My step faltered at the sight of my son. The physical resemblance to the child I'd raised a painful reminder of what had been lost. Brian looked up at that moment, his eyes widening in shock as they met mine. He clearly hadn't expected me to find my way back, to have resources and support. In that moment of surprise, I glimpsed something else in his expression. Calculation. Not remorse or shame, but the rapid recalibration of someone whose plans had hit an unexpected obstacle. Stephanie whispered something urgent to their attorney, who frowned and began shuffling through papers. They had expected this to be a simple matter, perhaps a default judgment when I failed to appear. My presence with legal representation had thrown them off balance. The hearing itself was mercifully brief but intense. Their attorney argued that I had willingly signed the deed transfer and then decided to live independently, a decision they had respected. My clients were naturally concerned when Mr. Thompson stopped responding to calls, he claimed smoothly. But adults, even elderly ones, have the right to make their own choices about where they live. Franklin countered with the security camera footage from the gas station, showing clearly that Brian and Stephanie had driven away while I was still inside. He presented my phone records, obtained through Detective James' investigation, showing the 25 missed calls I'd made to Brian over those crucial hours. Most damning was the medical evaluation Jessica had arranged, confirming I was fully competent and had no cognitive impairments that would justify the kind of intervention my son had attempted. "Your Honor," Franklin concluded, "this was a clear case of elder abuse and fraud. Mr. Thompson was coerced into signing documents he didn't fully understand, then literally abandoned 80 miles from home in an apparent attempt to prevent him from returning to claim his property." The judge, an older woman with silver hair and penetrating eyes, seemed particularly disturbed by the abandonment aspect of the case. "Counsel," she addressed Brian's attorney sharply, "your client's explanation for leaving an elderly man at a gas station without transportation or communication devices strains credibility to the breaking point." After brief deliberation, she issued a temporary restraining order, preventing any sale or alteration of my property, and scheduled a full hearing on the validity of the deed transfer for the following month. She also ordered that I be allowed immediate return to my home, with police escort if necessary. As we left the courtroom, Brian attempted to approach me, his expression now carefully arranged into contrition. "Dad," he began, "this is all a huge misunderstanding. We were coming right back for you. We just needed to check out the retirement community first to make sure it was suitable." Franklin stepped between us protectively. "Mr. Thompson has nothing to say to you outside the presence of counsel. Any communication should go through me." Stephanie pulled Brian away, her face tight with barely controlled anger. I watched them go, feeling a complex mixture of grief, betrayal, and a strange, sad relief at finally seeing them clearly for who they were. The investigation continued to build momentum. Detective James obtained a search warrant for Brian and Stephanie's home, where they discovered incriminating text messages discussing plans to sell my house immediately after the deed transfer. There were also email exchanges with a real estate agent dated weeks before I'd signed any documents, discussing potential listing prices and marketing strategies. Most shocking to me personally was the discovery of a storage unit they'd rented, containing family heirlooms and photo albums, already removed from my house during their frequent visits. Items I'd assumed were simply misplaced had been systematically taken. In preparation for the day they expected me not to return, Sandra called with another significant break in the case. The notary, Diane, had agreed to cooperate after being confronted with discrepancies in her documentation. She admits she was paid an extra $300 to backdate some of the documents and to state that all parties were present throughout the signing when in fact she was alone with you for part of the time, Sandra explained. That's a violation of notary regulations and potentially criminal if she knowingly facilitated fraud. With each new revelation, my case against Brian and Stephanie grew stronger, but the emotional toll was immense. Each piece of evidence was another confirmation that their betrayal had been calculated and deliberate, not a momentary lapse of judgment or misunderstanding. Through it all, the support system that had formed around me was my salvation. Franklin working tirelessly on the legal aspects, Detective James methodically building the criminal case, Jessica ensuring my welfare needs were met, Sandra leveraging her connections in the district attorney's office to keep my case a priority. Even Alan from the gas station called regularly to check on me, his youthful indignation at the injustice I'd suffered somehow comforting. And quietly, steadily, a plan for justice was taking shape. The day of the final hearing arrived 3 weeks later, the courtroom more crowded than for our initial appearance. News of the case had spread, attracting attention from elder rights advocates and local media concerned about financial exploitation of seniors. Brian and Stephanie arrived with a new attorney, even more polished and expensive-looking than the first. Their strategy had shifted from denial to damage control, offering a settlement that would return the house to me in exchange for dropping all criminal complaints. Franklin rejected it outright. "Too little, too late, Mr. Peterson," he told their attorney. "Your clients didn't just attempt to take Mr. Thompson's home. They abandoned him in a potentially life-threatening situation. The district attorney is proceeding with criminal charges regardless of the outcome today." The hearing itself was comprehensive, with testimony from financial experts about the deceptive nature of the transaction, from Detective James about the evidence of premeditation, and from me about the emotional manipulation that had preceded the abandonment. When the judge finally delivered her ruling, her words were unequivocal. "This court finds clear and convincing evidence of fraud, coercion, and elder abuse. The deed transfer from Karl Thompson to Brian Thompson is hereby declared null and void. Additionally, Brian and Stephanie Thompson shall be responsible for all legal fees incurred by Mr. Thompson in resolving this matter." She looked directly at Brian and Stephanie, her disapproval evident. "The court is also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. Elder abuse is not just a civil matter but a criminal one, with serious consequences." As we left the courthouse, reporters approached wanting statements about the case. Franklin fielded most questions professionally, emphasizing the importance of elder rights protections. I remained largely silent, still processing the mixed emotions of vindication tainted by the permanent fracture of my family. The criminal proceedings that followed resulted in Brian and Stephanie accepting a plea agreement that included 3 years probation, significant community service hours at senior centers, and mandatory counseling. They avoided jail time, which despite everything, I was grateful for. The thought of my son behind bars, regardless of his actions, was more than I could bear. Returning to my home after everything was resolved brought a complex wave of emotions. Relief at being in familiar surroundings again, sadness at the emptiness that seemed to echo through the rooms, anger at discovering what had been taken during my absence. The family photos from the hallway, Martha's jewelry box, albums documenting Brian's childhood, The antique mantel clock that had been my grandfather's. Not just valuable items, but the physical repositories of memories, now gone. I stood in my bedroom, looking at the empty space on the dresser where Martha's jewelry box had sat for decades, and finally allowed myself to weep for all that had been lost beyond recovery. But life, as I had taught countless students over my teaching career, continues its relentless forward movement, regardless of our personal tragedies. Slowly, I began rebuilding. My neighbor Susan brought over a casserole the day after I returned home, her simple kindness touching me deeply. Former students, hearing about the case through local media or Sandra's outreach, began stopping by with offers of help. Jack, my old friend who had warned me about Brian's intentions, showed up with woodworking tools and repaired the back porch steps that had been neglected during my absence, his quiet presence more healing than any words could have been. Most surprising was the friendship that developed with Alan from the gas station. He had testified at both hearings, his straightforward account of finding me abandoned, adding powerful weight to the case. Afterwards, he made the hour-and-a-half drive to visit me, initially just to check that I was settling back in safely. Those visits became regular, evolving into a weekly coffee meeting where we discussed everything from current events to his community college courses. "I know I'm just some random guy from a gas station," he said during one visit, "but I'm really glad things worked out for you, Mr. Thompson. You were the first person who helped me when my own family abandoned me, Alan," I replied. "That's not random. That's significant." With Franklin's continued guidance, I made proper, legitimate estate planning arrangements. I established a trust with clear provisions and selected trustees I could genuinely trust, including Jessica, who had gone above and beyond her professional duties in supporting me. My experience had left me with a newfound purpose. I began volunteering at the local senior center, sharing my story and helping educate other elderly residents about financial protection and warning signs of exploitation. The historian in me found satisfaction in documenting cases similar to mine, creating a record that might help others avoid the same pain. The first holiday season alone in my house was difficult. Brian sent a card with a handwritten letter expressing regret and asking for forgiveness, but I wasn't ready. Perhaps someday, but the wounds were still too fresh, the betrayal too profound. Instead, I hosted a small dinner for my new circle of supporters. Jack brought his famous apple pie. Sandra came with her husband and children. Franklin stopped by briefly. Alan drove in from his town. We were an eclectic group, bound together by unusual circumstances. But there was genuine warmth in that gathering that began to fill the hollow spaces grief had carved within me. Looking around at these people who had entered my life because of tragedy but remained by choice, I recognized a profound truth. Family is defined not just by blood, but by who stands beside you in your darkest moments. The people who help you find your way back to solid ground when the path disappears beneath your feet. The deed to my house was once again in my name, the legal documentation securely filed. But I had signed a different kind of deed in these past months. A commitment to move forward, to find meaning beyond betrayal, to rebuild a life that honored Martha's memory, while creating space for new connections. My name is Karl Thompson. I am 68 years old, a retired history teacher, a widower, a survivor of elder abuse, and a man discovering that even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for unexpected strengths. What about you? Has someone in your family ever betrayed your trust? How did you rebuild your life afterward? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, or might help someone you know, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. Together, we can bring awareness to elder abuse and remind each other that it's never too late to start again. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember to treat the elders in your life with the dignity and respect they deserve.